Well, then we will begin, and I want to start by welcoming everybody to today's webinar, where our topic is Winter Tree Identification, Part 2. And this is a follow-up and continuation of a webinar we presented about 2 weeks ago, and due to popular demand and the graciousness of our speaker, we're able to follow up with this session, which will give a little more detail on this topic of interest to everybody. My name is Neil Letson. I will be your host today, and I represent the Tennessee Urban-Forestry Council, who is working in partnership with the University of Tennessee's School of Natural Resources. It's our contribution which is able to work together and bring these webinars to you free of charge. And I do want to acknowledge a couple of other folks before we get really started who make a big contribution to putting these on. One is Katie Donaldson. She's with UT's School of Natural Resources and really is the wizard behind the webinar portion, technical portion of these webinars. And then there's Kevin Bolger, who is with the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council, and he is helping us improve our mailing list, notifications, and streamlining that whole process. So I really appreciate the effort of those two, Katie and Kevin. For our first-time viewers, today's webinar is part of a monthly series that's brought to you by the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council and the Department of Natural Resources at the University of Tennessee, where our purpose is to offer to you a wide range and variety of topics and speakers that hopefully will deepen your understanding of the importance of trees in our daily lives, especially in urban settings, but also will hopefully inspire you and the rest of us to grow healthier urban forests in the places where we live. That's our sole purpose. So before we begin and turn this over to our speaker, I do have a couple or three housekeeping items I want to talk about and cover. Number one, and of interest to a lot of you, are the ISA CEUs. This has been approved by the International Society for Arboriculture for 1 CEU. And the way we handle this is we just need your name and your certification number, either through the pre-registration, or if you're not sure if you've sent that to us, you can put that in the chat box. But we want to make sure we have your name aligned and associated with your certification number, and we will send that in to the proper authorities, and they will record that in your CEU listing. But the only thing that's going to be required from you for us to do this is you got to stick with us throughout the whole webinar, because we do take names at the end, and we want to make sure that we represent you correctly. Number two, Q&A. We do allow and we do encourage questions during the presentation, but what we like to do and to ask you to do is to send your questions into the chat room. And at the end of today's webinar, we have set aside some time for Katie to read those questions, at least as many as she can get to, and for Chris to answer those. And then the third thing is, I said this is part 2. For those of y'all that missed part 1, and if you did miss it, I encourage you to look at this link here that we have posted. We have archived Chris's first webinar on the winter tree identification, and I encourage you to, if you haven't seen this, to click that link, and there's great information that'll help you be a better dendrologist. So, trying to rush through all this so we can give Chris as much time as possible. And at this time, I do want to introduce Chris Graves, who is an instructor and a certified wildlife biologist at the University of Tennessee's Department of Natural Resources. He teaches the forestry class in dendrology. And Chris, we're pleased to have you with us. And I might want to add that you have set some records with our webinars. You're the first speaker that has given 2 webinars in 1 year, and you've also set records on pre-registration and attendance. So we're going to call you the Tom Brady of our webinar speakers. And anyway, it's just exciting to see the response, and appreciate you setting aside some time to help teach us about this important topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. I didn't know you were going to start off by insulting me I'm not a Tom Brady fan. As you well know, I bleed orange. I'm here at the University of Tennessee, and Peyton Manning, yeah, it's not even a debate. Peyton Manning's the greatest of all time. That's for sure. But yeah, Tom Brady, it is what it is, I guess. He just had a great coach. Let's see, I'll share my screen and try to get started here. I got to hide a few things. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, and actually, speaking of football, something I guess to mention is apparently, at least if you're in the United States and you're listening to this or watching, and maybe people throughout the world that have television watched the Super Bowl yesterday, but I guess it's supposed to be the most unproductive work day of the year. So if I don't do a good job with this part 2 series, maybe you won't even be paying attention today. So yeah, here we go on the most unproductive work day of the year, day after the Super Bowl. So I'm going to kind of lead in a little bit with this. We're in the state of Tennessee, and Tennessee is extremely biodiverse. If you look there, you'll see the Blue Ridge Mountains, part of Southern Appalachia. And then, of course, the University of Tennessee, as you can see, the Power T there is in the Ridge and Valley physiographic province, also known as the foothills. We might work our way westward. We end up on the Cumberland Plateau. And of course, the Cumberland Plateau and the Cumberland Mountains are different. Working our way toward Nashville. Nashville's in the Central Basin. And of course, you've got the Eastern Highland Rim, the Western Highland Rim that surround the Central Basin there. Of course, the Sequatchie Valley, West Tennessee uplands, kind of some rolling hills there. And eventually we hit the coastal plain and ultimately the Mississippi River floodplain. So because of these physiographic provinces, and we go from over 6,600 feet elevation all the way to the Gulf coastal plain and the Mississippi River, it's extremely, that geology just is phenomenal, and really drives the the geology, the climate, and everything drives all these different plant communities that you would see in the state of Tennessee. So it is extremely biodiverse here, and not just with trees, but also fish and just a variety of other species. So we'll get started here. But yeah, fortunately, with our program, we're able to travel quite a bit. But we go from the mountains to the Mississippi River floodplain. And I've already hit on a lot of that, but it's important to know where you're at in the landscape. And now if you look with categorization, that's generally how we learn things in the scientific community, as we just try to match things up based on similarities and eventually get down to maybe that species level or even subspecies level. I don't know if I'm happy about this or not, but geneticists are working in our profession. They make a lot of changes. They split a lot of things. I'm more of a lumper than a splitter, but that's going on currently, especially within our profession. A lot of name changes, even with Latin names too. So be prepared for some of that, but this is generally our approach, is try to utilize this categorization to try to get to a point where, okay, now it's manageable. It's something that I can comprehend, something that I can learn. But yeah, we started there with the physiographic provinces, but now let's really kind of focus in on our approach. I think your approach is going to be super important. It's something I went into more extensively in part 1 of winter tree identification. So we are in part 2, but let's get our minds right, okay? So think about where you're at in the landscape. So physiographic province. Also, am I standing in an upland or am I in a lowland or bottomland area? That's going to be very important because that's potentially going to drive what tree species or woody plants you're going to find on the landscape. Also, is the site dry, meaning xeric? So are you on a xeric site or are you on a mesic site, more of a moist site or wet site, sorry. And then what types of soils are you in? And that's something, at least here in the US, with the web soil survey that NRCS has. I've given you that as part of part 1, where you can do a little homework before you even do a site visit or plan a hike or whatever it is that you, the area that is that you're about to visit. You can actually go on the web soil survey, look at the different soil types, and even some of the dominant tree species you might potentially find there. And then natural disturbances, has there been a hurricane in the recent past? A lot of different things then with natural disturbances that could drive what species you find there. Some sun-loving species, if you did have maybe a major wind event that set back succession, and now all of a sudden we're starting again with more of an early successional community, a pioneer community. And then past land use. This is critical. And if you can find this out from locals or just through other research, the past land use, that can also be very telling in what species you'll probably find. And then range maps. Don't ever forget to utilize your range maps when you're, boots on the ground, planning this sort of thing out. So we'll look at this as far as groupings, again, that categorization. And I think this is helpful. So forest cover types of the United States and Canada, you can see there on the left, the book cover, at least part of it. Society of American Foresters has put that out, and it's still relevant today. On the right, you can see this is just an example of one of the field guides, one of many field guides, but wildflowers and plant communities of the Southern Appalachians. And here's someone that took a lot of time and did a great work by putting together, these different plant community types. It's just phenomenal how, some people have done such a good job, I think, in putting things together and getting us to a point where, okay, now we're paying attention to what kind of forest cover type am I in, or what kind of plant community type am I in? Usually if we say plant community type, then we're getting into more details probably, and we may be including wildflowers and other herbaceous plant material. Vegetation types is something that we utilize or say often in our profession. And to me, vegetation type is very important. And with that, we may even look at the age of a particular stand that you're in. Young forest, for example, would be 0 to 15 years old. But anyhow, just know that all these are more or less the same in a sense. Okay, forest cover types, plant community types, vegetation types. So my approach then is always, for the most part, it's going to be, where am I in the landscape? And we're going to first go on to dry uplands. I'll kind of pick up where we left off in part 2 and give you some examples of some trees or common tree species, or maybe dominant tree species you would find in dry uplands here in our region. And maybe this can be useful, I think, a useful approach for you where you may be working. So chestnut oak, Quercus montana, Montana being mountain. This is a common tree in our region, occurs in dry uplands, and it's one to be on the lookout for. It's in the white oak group, and we'll talk more about the white oak species here in a little while. But let's look at chestnut oak and kind of pick up where we left off with that. When you look at the bark of chestnut oak, of course, we've gone over in part 1, the ridges and furrows. So this is a tree species that has ridges and furrows. So in this case, though, it has tall ridges, real chunky bark almost, and then deep furrows. And within those deep furrows, you can oftentimes see this, it's a fungus in there, but it oftentimes is orange, looks like orange vertical stripes inside those furrows. That bark, I don't want to get too much into silvics and uses and stuff, but that bark used to be used to make tannins a long time ago. And then think about decomposition. So again, look up, look down, look all around. So as you're looking down on the ground in the wintertime, you should see a lot of dead leaves. And maybe, though, you'll find the ones that belong to that tree. So chestnut oak, of course, We'll talk about the leaves in a minute, but keep in mind as decomposition is taking place, you've got a lot of bacteria, you may have fungi, but especially insects and stuff that are kind of gnawing away at the leaf, and also, playing a critical role in that decomposition process. So, ultimately you should be looking for leaves that are fairly intact and that are going to have the characteristics that you need or may be familiar with from summer identification. So with a white oak group, white oaks are in the subgenus Leucobalanus. Latin leuco means white. But if you look here at these leaves, of course, these are green leaves, summertime. Chestnut oak has the wavy leaf margin. Think about this, your sinuses are on the inside of your face, right? So the sinuses are on the inside and the lobes are on the outside. So if you look, it has these wavy kind of rounded lobes, right? This wavy margin leaf. I think the rounded lobes is something to look for, typically with the white oak species, all the different white oaks that may fall under Leucobalanus. But the leaves often lack then bristles. Not all, but most of the time, your white oaks are not going to have bristle tips. And we'll be looking at some of those here in a little while. With oak trees, you also have clustered buds. So that's what we can see here on the left side. You see a lot of long, skinny, sharp-pointed, almost orange or chestnut brown buds here on this chestnut oak. But again, these are clustered buds, and that's going to be a good characteristic for oak trees. Oak trees are also going to have fairly stout twigs, usually moderately stout. So when we think about twig size, you have obviously very stout or large twigs, and you have moderately stout twigs, and then maybe slender twigs. And then twig size is maybe dependent upon the leaves that were on the tree during the summertime and or the fruit or seeds. So if you have heavy leaves, like a big compound leaf, or you have heavy seeds, like oak acorns, or what we would say here, pronounce it as acorns, but also hickory nuts, things like that, walnuts. When you have a heavy seeded species, it's generally going to have really stout twigs, or again, potentially heavy leaves. Whereas if you have simple leaves, and the seeds are really small and they don't weigh much at all, then you're generally going to have those slender twigs. So just to make mention of that. Also with oaks, they'll have these angled twigs, and that's what you can see there. It's not perfectly round. You can see there's quite a bit of shape, almost like a muscular arm or a muscular leg, but you can see that angled twig pretty good of chestnut oak here on the left. All right, moving on to oak acorns. So 1 to 1.5 inches long and typically skinny, I would say. So long, skinny acorns, but very large, probably the largest in our region as far as oak acorns go. And then a thin acorn cap. So we'll be looking in more detail here at this in just a second. But notice where it is thin. It's thin around that acorn cap margin. Some people refer to the acorn cap as a cup, but the margin of that is extremely thin and almost looks brittle on the chestnut oak. So here we go. Chestnut oak is in the white oak group. And here are some things maybe that may help you to separate and kind of narrow it down to, am I looking at a red oak here, or am I looking at a white oak here? And knowing then that there's multiple species within the white oak group and the red oak group. So with acorns, we can see here the acorn cap, aka the cup, also known as the cup, but also cupule, if you get very scientific and use some of the scientific terminology. But the acorn cap then will have these scales, all right? And then typically with white oaks, those scales are going to be thicker. This is generally speaking. So look for that, those generally thicker scales, and oftentimes almost has like a callus on the base, all right? And then the acorn cap, the underside of it, okay, the inner surface of the cup or the cap is generally going to be free of hairs and smooth, all right? So smooth and free of hairs, be looking for that. on these acorn caps. Next up is, I was talking about forest cover types and even plant communities. So something else to keep in mind is we'll have dominant species in a particular forest cover type, like chestnut oak, but then we'll have what we call forest associates. So those are the ones that can sometimes give you the most trouble and be a little bit harder to identify. We may not use them as much as far as wood products. They may have some value, may have a lot of ecological value, but these are the ones that can be, fairly difficult. So just to mention this is sourwood, Oxydendrum arboreum. And anyway, sourwood is one of those forest associates occurring primarily in the mid-story, always generally crooked and sort of reaching for light, because there's a lot of times there's not a lot of light, making its way through the canopy to these trees. So they are just, again, oftentimes crooked, reaching for that sunlight. The bark actually of sourwood, to me, resembles chestnut oak a little bit. So it's not real blocky, but you see it does have ridges and furrows, and real deep furrows, real kind of chunky or almost blocky ridges. So, the bark itself and the characteristics there look similar to chestnut oak. But again, this is not a tree that you would confuse with chestnut oak once it's, 5 or 7 inches diameter. Also, some other things to look for then with sourwood, you can see the twig down on the lower right. The twigs are usually red or red and green. So one side oftentimes on the twig is red. The other side, if you flip it over, will be more green or greenish in color. And they have these embedded buds. So they don't really have a true terminal bud, which means they have a pseudo-terminal bud or false terminal bud. The buds, especially the lateral buds and everything, these are more or less embedded buds. They're tiny. And then they have these raised leaf scars, kind of a half circle leaf scar that's raised and tan in color. If you break the twig and you smell those sap odors, and again, you should have a pocket knife when you're doing this stuff, you'll notice it has kind of a rude odor. And then too, when you're looking around for leaves and or seeds and things like that, you might see the dried flowers from sourwood laying on the ground to help you, to identify this tree. Of course, most of you know about sourwood honey and know that it is an important tree for pollinators and even beekeepers. All right, moving on. So just to try to kind of tie back in, we're thinking about, what tree species naturally occur together on these particular sites. And I always try to teach the students about, who are their best friends. So you think about chestnut oak and these dry uplands. Oftentimes, one of its best friends tends to be, the black oak, Quercus velutina. And if you're looking around in these dry uplands, black oak should stand out because the bark is almost black. So this is a tree, as you're looking around, maybe that's the best approach, is rather than just walking straight up the tree and trying to figure it out, but look ahead. Always look ahead. That's something we do when we mark timber, and we're trying to identify these trees, a chain, or that's 66 feet, or let's say 30 or 50 yards ahead. I'm looking and I'm scanning for trees by species, and I'm going ahead and kind of picking out, which trees I'm going to paint and which ones I'm not going to paint, for example, if we're practicing silviculture. So yeah, black oak will generally have really dark bark. This is a species that will stand out for the most part. And if you use your pocket knife and get into that inner bark, the inner bark of black oak is very orange. Orange is in Tennessee orange, not like Clemson orange. Clemson is not orange. Let's just be real about this. Syracuse is not orange. The University of Tennessee, whether you like the color or not, we are a true orange. So anyhow, that's what you'll see there with the inner bark. Now, when we look at these leaves, these are red oak leaves. Okay, so red meaning erythro, so erythrobelanus meaning it's in the red oak group. And red oak leaves then will have these bristle tips. And you can see the arrows then hopefully pointing to those bristle tips. And of course, those lobes tend to be or appear almost sharp pointed. But I think the bristles are the reason that they appear to be so sharp, but less rounded than white oak. And then again, we're focused mainly on winter ID. So let's go back just to emphasize, some of these species will have marquescent leaves. Marquescence meaning that they hold on to their leaves, or the leaves persist into the winter months. And you'll see that sometimes with Fagaceae, which is a beech family, but oak sometimes will retain those to an extent, maybe not as much as beech. Now, when we're looking up, if you have a pair of binoculars, and I highly recommend it when you're practicing dendrology or trying to identify trees, having a pair of binoculars can be super handy if you can't just climb up the tree to see these twigs, or if there are no twigs low to the ground that you can reach. Because black oak, for the species here in our region, has the largest buds of these oak trees here around East Tennessee. And you'll notice these large buds are on moderately stout twigs. The twigs are angled. We have clustered buds. We know it's an oak. But when you look at those buds, you'll notice they almost appear velvety. So they are heavily pubescent, almost velvety. And not only that, I've seen them to where they're almost a tawny pubescence, like you see on the right. I've seen that before, tawny meaning more tan colored maybe. And then the ones on the left, I've seen them to where they're, almost an ash gray in color. So be on the lookout for these large, heavily pubescent, almost velvety buds that you'll see on black oak. And then when you see the acorns of black oak, you'll notice the scales, the cap scales or cup scales are very thin, and that's typical of the red oak family. I'll get into more of that in a minute. But with black oak specifically, to me, the cup scales or cap scales look kind of like old wood shingles on a house. Okay, so wood shingles on a house that need to be replaced. You can see they are sort of peeling away or shaggy there, especially toward the margins of that acorn cap. But again, that's a telltale sign you've got black oak. Not many other acorns in our region are going to have scales like this. The only one that comes to mind that doesn't occur here naturally would be bur oak, but it has a mossy looking fringe. And those are things that may help you, though, to separate out one species from another. So the red oak group, Erythroblanus, and forgive me if I don't pronounce all that correctly. No offense, Latin is a dead language. I probably got at least one Latin instructor here, but as long as I can spell it, I kind of feel good about that. But yeah, please forgive me if I mispronounce things, especially the Latin words. But notice the scales are typically thin. That's going to be very common in the red oak group. So these acorn caps, if you see thin scales and they're oppressed meaning kind of flat, looks like they've been ironed on, they don't have that kind of bumpiness to them or that callus, then you're probably looking at a red oak acorn. And then the underside or the inner surface of the acorn cap is generally going to be somewhat hairy and or pubescent. So be looking for that as well to help separate out your white oak acorn caps versus your red oak acorn caps. Southern red oak, to me, is always a hard one with bark ID because it doesn't have any characteristics that jump out at you. So here's a tree that may look a little bit like black oak, but not quite as dark. And then again, it's just kind of a dark gray. It does have ridges and furrows. The ridges, you can see maybe in this picture, they are broken with cracks, these horizontal cracks running through the ridges. But for the most part, it's pretty difficult to ID just bark ID alone. Again, we're talking about Quercus falcata, variety falcata. But notice, just kind of a dull gray bark. Looks strong, looks like an oak tree, but not a lot of characteristics that really jump out. Now, if you look around, especially southern red oak, I think, retains its leaves a little more than some of these other red oaks. So you should see probably a a clump of dead leaves, that may be hanging from a branch. And again, with binoculars, or maybe even with a naked eye, you might be able to notice then the leaves of southern red oak, which are quite easy in comparison to the things that it naturally occurs with, because you'll notice the rounded base, and then you may notice the deep lobe, the deep sinuses, and then the long lobes, especially those top 3 lobes. So a lot of people refer to this one, like if you look at the one in the background, it almost looked like a turkey track. So a wild turkey track there. So you see the 3. But if you turn the leaf upside down, think about southern bell. It has kind of a bell-shaped leaf because of that rounded base. So if you flip it upside down, looks like a bell, southern red oak, or turkey track, whatever helps you to identify this species. Southern red oak twigs, then, if you look here, you'll notice reddish bud scales, and then the fringes or margins of those bud scales has pubescence. So that's something to note for sure. Moderately stout twigs, oftentimes those twigs are going to be angled. And then if you look at the lateral buds they're big. They're kind of swollen at the base, kind of rounded, coming to a sharp point, almost perfect buds, but they all come out at almost a 45-degree angle. And then the acorns are smaller. They're about the size of maybe the end of your pinky, I guess, in size, but usually, a ½ inch or less, maybe 1/4 inch in size. Perfect, thin, flat scales. They're oppressed. They do appear like they've been ironed on, and then perfectly knit together. You can see almost like a little shelf there where it actually, the cup or the cap actually touches the acorn. Scarlet oak, another one of the friends. So scarlet oak, Quercus coccinea, occurring primarily on dry sites, xeric sites, uplands, and anyhow, it's one of the red oak species, and we'll get into some details about it now. This extra picture is to show you this, but you'll notice the ridges. It has ridges and furrows, but the ridges are flat. All right. And with these flat ridges, they look like ski slopes, or ski tracks. So if you see that from a distance, you're probably thinking, okay, I've got a northern red oak here. Well, scarlet oak will oftentimes have these sort of ski tracks or ski slopes as well. The difference is typically scarlet oak will also, when they get larger and they're mature trees, they'll have very blocky bark at the base. And what happens then is those flat ridges stop at about breast height. So pay attention to that. Look for that where it stops at about breast height. And you can see that pretty well in the picture on the right. Another few things to look for. Well, the picture on the far right, you can see the kind of the blocky bark that's starting to develop there as this tree's getting larger. That's about breast height where the ski tracks or those flat ridges stop. And then you'll see maybe the tree in the summertime surrounded by all the green foliage in the background. You can see those ski tracks pretty good, I hope. And then another thing that's a good characteristic for scarlet oak is they tend to hold on to those old branches. So you'll see what appear to be these old branches or stobs sticking out about midway up the tree. So be looking for those. Oftentimes they're black, and hopefully you can see the red arrow pointing at that there. And then they have extremely deep sinuses, C-shaped sinuses. That's something to look for. If you were to put the leaf up to your face, all right, and your nose is there, it's being blocked by that mid vein. Okay, but if I was holding that leaf up, you'd be able to see my 2 eyes. Okay, I could still look at you just clearly because of those deep sinuses. I can still see out and almost put it up to my face like a mask with scarlet oak leaves. You would not be able to do that with northern red oak, which we'll look at here in a minute. As far as buds, clustered buds, just like the oaks, two-tone buds. So you'll notice the base is red and then the tip appears white. But with closer inspection, you should always have a hand lens. If you're looking at these under a magnifier, you should see, hey, that's not a white tip. It's just extremely hairy. So it's heavily pubescent, and that gives it that white appearance. So red base, white tip, two-tone buds, clustered buds on an angled stem, scarlet oak. And in the acorns, if you look here, they've got those concentric rings on the tip. So you can see those rings, looks like ripples if you were to throw a stone or a rock out in the water, and then you have that ripple effect. You can see those on the tip. And then to me, you see those cap scales, I hope, especially the ones on the left, they look like they've been cleaned a little bit, almost waxed. So there's kind of a shine or a little bit of a, a glisten, I guess, but a little bit of a kind of a glossy appearance to those cup or cap scales on scarlet oak. All right. And then I think hopefully you can see that here. They appear real clean and kind of shiny. Northern red oak should occur further down the slope. So there is a transition point where you'll have both species naturally occurring. Now the problem is we've had a lot of changes on our landscape and fire suppression, things like that have led to kind of a conglomeration of all kinds of species that are occurring in places where they shouldn't. But for the most part, naturally, I would say northern red oak is not going to be necessarily up in those extremely xeric sites like you would find chestnut oak and scarlet oak. But if you go on the north facing slope, so the north aspect, or you work your way down slope and you're in a cove or near water, then you're going to pick up northern red oak. And northern red oak and scarlet oak, although they may occur at some point, as you work your way down slope, you should find more and more northern red oak and less scarlet oak. Look again, though, for the ski slope. So this one has the ski slopes. It's classic. I think it's in most of the field guides. It mentions this. That's just those flat ridges that appear like ski tracks down the tree. This is Quercus rubra, and you can see it good there, especially in the summertime or late summer, almost fall. But with that foliage there and the picture on the right, maybe that depicts it pretty well. Now, if you look at these ski tracks, okay, these flat ridges, they should work their way down the tree, especially these mature trees as they get larger. They should go all the way down to about knee height or shin height for most people. So the big northern red oaks, they don't have quite the blocky bark at the base on the larger trees. So those flat ridges continue down further down on the tree, at 2 to 3 feet above the ground. And then you'll see that the this is in the red oak group. It has bristle tips. So we're looking at the leaves here, and it does have northern red oak, the sun leaves, which are more classic and what you see in field guides and stuff. The ones that are getting plenty sun, shade leaves are much larger. A lot of times the variation in leaf shape it gets a little crazy. But with sun leaves, you will see the sinuses are pretty deep, go about halfway to the mid vein there, not almost all the way to the mid vein like with scarlet oak. When you get your hands on the twigs, if that's possible, moderately stout twigs, clustered buds, angled twig, but then you'll notice these smooth buds that are deep, kind of dark red. So red, dark buds, they come to a sharp point for the most part. And yeah, this is just classic, 2 classic twigs of northern red oak. They're not heavily pubescent. Again, they're smooth with these northern red oak buds. Northern red oak acorns are pretty easy to identify. They're quite large. Those in chestnut oak are both very large, 1.5 inches or for the most part. But if you look at the cap, you'll notice the thin scales, okay? They're flat or oppressed. And then the cap is very shallow. And it has kind of a beanie cap appearance. So look for that beanie cap of northern red oak acorns. White oak, as we move along here, could be found with, a wide variety of these species that we've now covered. But we'll get into some details about this species, Quercus alba. You'll notice it has vertical strips. Some people may say vertical plates. So you will see then that white oak has whitish bark for the most part with these sort of vertical strips or vertical plates. Almost has a shaggy bark appearance like you see here. This is pretty important for a lot of bat species. Tree roosting bats will utilize this white oak bark to roost, but the shaggy appearance of white oak is more obvious as you look up into the tree a little bit higher. White oak, Quercus alba, is in the white oak subgenus, but either way, it's got the rounded lobes in. It lacks bristles, doesn't have bristles, and then deep sinuses. But I want to caution you on white oak leaves or leaves in general. Again, this is not the end all be all. To me, the DNA fingerprint is still the twigs, because you can see right here from one of the books that I have, you can see these are all Quercus alba leaves and wide variation, as you can see, among one species. White oak twigs, the buds are rounded or blunt tipped. So be looking for that. They tend to be kind of brown scales with they're glabrous or smooth. So smooth brown scales with blunt tips. And oftentimes those buds are fairly small in comparison to the moderately stout twig that you can see there. Now, when we look at the white oak acorn caps, you can see it has a knobby acorn cap. So it's got the knobs on there, prominent knobs that make it stand out versus the rest. The acorn itself is, maybe about an inch long, maybe less, maybe a little more, depending on the individual acorn. But yeah, they tend to be smooth and almost shiny when they're brown. Now we're moving on to some pines, and I'll move kind of quickly here, but Virginia pine, this is a tree that to me looks to be sick and dying. It appears unhealthy. The needles themselves almost have kind of a yellowish hue. So they're yellowish green needles, not rich green. Also, people will say Virginia pine, Pinus virginiana, is crooked and lots of branches too. So it's not worth a whole lot. Although, we can get some pulpwood from this tree. We could potentially get maybe a little bit of lumber. It's just not widely used. So crooked as heck and ain't worth a crap, is something that people maybe grew up. That's how they describe the Virginia pine. But this is helpful then by knowing those crooked as heck and, ain't worth a crap. I mean, well, now all of a sudden we're actually describing the tree from a dendrology standpoint. So this is something to look for. So to me, though, it does appear to be unhealthy in comparison to some of the other pines we're going to look at in a second. It does have scales. And I think this is great because we have this from that book I showed you, the Bark ID book. Here's the drawing with the scales. And then if you look to the right now, you can actually see the bark of Virginia pine, and it is, it's scales. So smaller than your hand, about the size of maybe cornflakes. If you rub your hand up and down the tree, then those scales, many of those outer scales will just slough right off. Also, think about, the fascicle. So the fascicle is almost like a wooden rubber band that holds these needles, these bundles together. And so how many needles per fascicle or per bundle do we have with Virginia pine? So Virginia pine, V Virginia, think about that, but 2. So 2 needles per fascicle and slightly twisted on most of those individuals. When we look at the cones, so you have cone scales, the scales have really sharp prickles. So really sharp prickles on Virginia pine cones. The cones are about maybe the size of a baseball or even a racquetball. But real sharp prickles, be on the look out for those. And then if you look at the cone from the top and you're looking down and you've got an open cone, maybe dry weather, or you've collected some cones and brought them indoors, look for what we say, those scales almost appear to be have had a manicure. So it looks like those outer scales, you can see really pretty colors there. appears as if, the cone itself has had a manicure. Some students say it looks like turkey tail feathers. Some may see rabbit ears on the inside. But again, all this stuff can be used to identify this species. Shortleaf pine. This is a tree that's very common throughout the South, has a very wide range. Everybody talks about longleaf pine, but shortleaf pine is super important. And if you look at the range there, it's from the upper coastal plain all the way into the lower mountains here. Lower mountains is in, around the foothills and a little bit of the Blue Ridge, but once you get higher elevation, you won't see much shortleaf pine. But you can imagine in a site generalist for the most part. This tree, if you look at it and you compare it to that Virginia pine, those two might occur together, but shortleaf pine is super straight typically. So you've got this nice straight tree. You could imagine loading that on a logging truck sort of thing. So it's just perfect. You could make a telephone pole out of it. Good wood, but also notice the crown. So it's self-pruned itself. All right. So if you look up at the crown of that tree, it's more dome shaped. And if you look at the green needles, I mean, it's a rich green, looks super healthy in comparison to the kind of yellowish green needles or sick looking needles of the Virginia pine. All right. And then the bark has plates. So platy bark, again, plates the size of your hand or maybe a little bit larger. And you can see the platy bark of shortleaf pine here. But if you look close, this is a tree you should be able to identify without even looking up, because on those plates, typically you'll see these resin pockets. They look like little moon craters or resin holes. This is just more platy bark as far as pictures of, or a picture of some shortleaf pines. You can see the platy bark. Shortleaf pine needles, generally 2 per fascicle. Again, rich green, and they typically have longer needles than Virginia pine. Shortleaf pine cones, as you can see there, they're egg-shaped. The scales, they have deciduous prickles. So when the scales are laying on the ground, oftentimes you have a gray umbo or gray scales, and those prickles have fallen off. Now, mid-elevation, here we go. So we're in the mountains, and as we go up in elevation, we start to pick up a couple more yellow pine species. Pitch pine is one of those, and it says 2,300 feet to 3,200 feet elevation. These trees can't read. So even though a book or some nice scientific source that you're using may say, hey, 2,300 feet to 3,200 feet, that's that mid-elevation range where you're going to find pitch pine. Well, I've seen a lot of pitch pine around 1,800 feet here. So you can pick them up around 1,800 feet pretty commonly, but they're going to thrive at this mid-elevation zone, which is what we have here, 2,300 feet to 3,200 feet. This is a pine tree of the mountains. So if you look at the range map, it's not going to occur in the Piedmont or the coastal plain like the shortleaf pine that we just looked at. So this is a mountain tree here. And then pitch pine needles, to me, I worked a lot in the coastal plain, so those needles tend to be longer than these others in comparison, and they're very full and rich and almost look like a miniature longleaf pine, I guess you could say. But anyhow, look for those rich, longer needles, real nice, full branches with those, dense foliage that you see here on pitch pine. And then look for the cones. The cones are about the size of a baseball. We pitch a baseball. And you can see they have a very flat base when they're open. When they're closed, they kind of look, especially when they're closed and they're gray, they kind of look like a bald-faced hornet's nest. But anyhow, pitch pine cones are really, they're much larger, I guess, when you're looking up in a tree versus the cones of, Virginia pine, which would be close to the same size. And then pitch pine will have this sort of epicormic branching. You'll have the green needles then that come out of the trunk. So on the bole or the trunk of the tree, you should see these green needles. And sometimes they'll have so many, the tree looks hairy from a distance. And when you walk up, you're like, man, what? I didn't know what that was. But occasionally it might only have a little bit. a few needles sticking out of the trunk. So that just depends on the individual. Pitch pine needles. So here we go. A pitcher tries for 3 strikes. So pitch pine again, we talked about the pitch pine cones being about the size of a baseball. We pitch baseballs, and then 3 strikes, you're out. So, pitch pine has 3 needles per fascicle. Typically, they're twisted and rigid. So this is just another look at those cones. And now if we work our way up in elevation, we'll have this transition zone. We've got one here near campus where you can get shortleaf pine, Virginia pine, pitch pine, and table mountain pine all in one place, right? But again, getting into that kind of sweet spot for these species, the high elevation pine here in Southern Appalachians is the table mountain pine. So you can see it generally starts to really thrive at 2,500 feet elevation, all the way up to 4,600 feet elevation. And the higher the elevation, then eventually you end up in pure table mountain pine stands. That's Pinus pungens. If you notice the bark here, and you notice these needles are densely clustered together, unlike the pitch pine. So again, these densely clustered needles on the branches, and these large cones. These cones are really big, and oftentimes they're whorled around the branches. So, they're arranged kind of in a circle around the branches, or they're whorled. So Pinus pungens actually means prickly or sharp pointed. So if you've gone into any of the areas here in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, for example, after this wildfire that we had, well, that was really good for table mountain pine. So now we've got all these young table mountain pines that are growing real thick like a chia pet. I mean, it looks green like a chia pet from a distance when you look at the mountain slopes and you see those areas of table mountain pine. But we walk through it oftentimes to collect data and stuff, and these things will prick you or poke you pretty good. They're sharp pointed. They're also very stiff, these needles are. But a lot like Virginia pine, they're 2 and slightly twisted, 2 needles per fascicle and slightly twisted and stiff. And then, this is the one that has the pine cones with the real stout prickles. They come to an extremely sharp point, almost like a talon on a bird of prey, like a hawk or an owl. So they have these talon-like prickles. These are stout cones. They're heavy. They're dense. There's a lot to them. Should help you to be able to identify this tree to species. Now, downslope, but just to mention, our only soft pine in our region. The others are hard pines. They're yellow pines in that group. But we do have one species of soft pine, eastern white pine here. 5 needles per fascicle. We'll look at that. But look at the color of eastern white pine. To me, eastern white pine is not rich green like these last 3 we talked about. It's not that yellowish green or kind of sick look of the Virginia pine, but the needles here to me look kind of bluish green, almost like a bluish hue to the tree overall. Another thing to look for, other than kind of the blue-green needles of eastern white pine, is that layering. So if you look, it's whorled branches, W-H-O-R-L-E-D, whorled. So they have whorled branches. So every year they put on a new layer of branches, which makes it cool because this is a tree that you can age and get close to the age probably within about 3 years by just counting each layer of branches from bottom to top. So look for the whorled branching, look for the bluish green needles, also the straight growth form of eastern white pine. They get very tall. So when they grow in competition, like the ones that naturally occur in our forests, they could be over 200 feet tall. Now, those would be champion trees. We have a few of those, but typically, they're much taller, especially once they're mature. And if they've grown in good soil under competition, you're going to see a lot of really tall eastern white pines. Pinus strobus. Bark ID, you'll see the one in the middle is, that would be what we call young bark, but smooth with horizontal lenticels. The one on the right, you can see now all of a sudden we have scales, but if you look at each of those scales, you'll see the horizontal lenticels there within each of those scales. And then it eventually ends up with more of that blocky bark once it's mature or really old. So the bark does change over time. But I think with, like the whorled branching, you can see it very good on that young individual, the tree species there, or the individual in the middle picture. You can see the whorled branching really good there. But anyhow, bark ID is not too bad with eastern white pine. Plus, it's extremely sticky. So if y'all have ever climbed white pine trees, you probably had to throw away your clothes. I mean, it's rough. So yeah, extremely sticky. The cones, the bark, the branches, everything about it's sticky because of that resin. All right, and then this is just another picture. You can see the kind of blocky bark of eastern white pine, the really big ones that we see out in the wild. And then I don't know if y'all can see the blue, but I see bluish green here when I see these needles. And of course, we already mentioned 5 needles per fascicle. And then the eastern white pine cones are shaped a lot like a banana, especially once they're older, like the ones on the right. These are female structures, right? The strobili, but they've got kind of a curve to them like a banana. And then those outer scales, they'll be gray at first when they're younger, they're brown, but they'll have that sticky resin and no prickles. And the scales themselves tend to be kind of pliable. So you're able to kind of squeeze them a little bit. They're not stiff. All right, here we go. Let's see. Oh, I'm running out of time. If I can, I'm going to spend 2 minutes. I'm going to go through these. These are gimmies, lobs, or alley-oops. Means these are real easy. And I'm going to go fast. I know some of you, your lunch break is about over. But we'll continue to record. And if it's okay, Neil, I'm going to go for 2 more minutes. And I'm not trying to say that, hey, this is real easy. It's not. Winter tree identification is difficult. It's challenging. This is just to hopefully boost your confidence that, hey, you can do this. So you can see the smooth bark on this tree on the left, right? It really stands out. You see the marquescent leaves there. And that alone should narrow you down to, okay, I'm looking at an American beech. And then just to be sure, a lot of times beech trees, they're fairly shade tolerant. So you'll still have branches down low, and then you can check those twigs for those long, skinny, sharp-pointed, cigar-shaped buds on these slender, shiny twigs. Dead giveaway. Another gimme or a lob would be the bone tree or the ghost tree. So you can see the white bark on the American sycamore. Also, sycamores are, primarily found near water. So, if you're near water, you're down in a valley or a wetland area, wherever it may be, it should be a gimme, as far as identifying this. You can see the sycamore balls, which are technically achenes, but even the twigs are easy. Zigzag twigs, they're shiny. And then if you look at the buds themselves, they're cone shaped. They've got one scale, and that scale's maroon or kind of green. And then the leaf scar is very narrow, where the leaf petiole actually hid the bud during the summertime. So once that abscission takes place, the leaf falls off, that leaf scar is extremely narrow, but surrounds the bud, encircles the bud that is cone shaped. I tell you what, I'm about out of time. So I've got some other gimmies and lobs. Let me flip through these. American hornbeam, eastern hop hornbeam. I was going to talk about the differences there. Of course, Betulaceae. You got catkins, and then you have seeds. You got some marquescent leaves, primarily on eastern hop hornbeam, not American hornbeam. I was just going to point out a few things. American hornbeam, you can see the bud scales are actually maroon and white, versus the bud scales of eastern hop hornbeam. They're maroon and green. So, a lot of things here. And plus, this is glabrous or smooth. So it's not hairy. It's not pubescent. Eastern hop hornbeam is hairy and pubescent, especially when you put a magnifier on it. It's extremely hairy most of the time. And the bark is totally different. So there's a lot going on here. River birch, kind of a gimme. Here's yellow birch, black birch. I was getting close to being done, I think. And then here we go with hickories. These are some common hickories that we have here. And I guess let me wrap up with this. So, this is it. Y'all can do this. All I've done is gone and gotten pictures, some of my own, some from others, And anyhow, you can, maybe one of your best tools to study other than the field guide is start building a PowerPoint. I think that's very helpful, because if you build a PowerPoint and you start looking up, for example, top left, that's bitternut hickory, and you may need to plug in like Coria cordiformis in your search engine, but you start looking at, Coria cordiformis twig or bitternut hickory twig, and just, you're actually studying and learning as you're looking for the best picture. So this can be really helpful. Same goes for the bark. The bitternut hickory bark is actually on the, it's on the top right. But anyhow, I won't go into the details of how we know that, but interlacing bark, you have ridges and furrows, looks like a fishnet almost, real tight to the tree, unlike these other three. But yeah, you're studying by putting together, these PowerPoints. And then bitternut hickory seeds, it has those winged sutures. So you can see on the thin husks, you can see the wings that are sticking out on the seed of bitternut hickory. You can see that on the top right. Other things, like here we have walnut, and I'm wrapping up, but top left, for example, that's white walnut or butternut. Top right is black walnut, and they're different. Both of them have a monkey's face, leaf scar. You can see the monkey face, the eyes and the mouth and everything. But notice the monkey on the left, the butternut or white walnut, it has eyebrows, heavily pubescent above the leaf scar, giving that monkey eyebrows, versus, there's no pubescence or dense hair on the top of the leaf scar of black walnut. And then if you look down, butternut, the one on the bottom left, you can see the terminal bud is colored like butter. It's the color of butter, versus black walnut, bottom right, it's tends to be whitish when you look at the naked buds or terminal buds of these two walnut species. And in juggling scenario, the butternut or white walnut, both walnuts have a chambered pith, but the chambered pith of the white walnut, believe it or not, is actually darker, almost black or chocolate brown or dark chocolate brown. And then on the right, you can see Jugglin's Niagara, black walnut, the chambered pith is lighter brown. So that's the only thing that's kind of odd about that. Then with the seeds, you have round walnuts for black walnut. You can see the green husk, kind of like a tennis ball. That corrugated nut is on the bottom right, which is round. And then on the top right, you'll see the white walnut or butternut shaped like a football. Those husks are actually real sticky, unlike black walnut. Black walnut's not sticky. If you grab fresh white walnut or butternuts, you'll notice that husk is real sticky typically, and then shaped like a football. And you can see the corrugated nut on the bottom left. And then butternut or white walnut, you can see on the right, has flat scales. So it has kind of like ski tracks, similar to northern red oak and scarlet oak, which we went over. And in the bottom left, you'll see sort of the ski tracks of butternut there, versus the real chunky bark and the ridges and furrows, the steep ridges and deep furrows of the black walnut. Plus black walnut has almost a black appearance when you see it from a distance, similar to the black oak like we talked about earlier. And then, so this is my last slide, but it's so hard to try to do this, in just one little session. But there's a lot we could talk about. If we did go to the Mississippi River floodplain, or we're in the coastal plain, really hydrology dictates what species we find there. So you got this hydrology that's the driving factor, and it's the elevation then and the hydrology together that's going to drive what species you find on a particular site. So as an example, you can see the stream channel or the river, and then the first levee, natural levee at that, would oftentimes be colonized by river birch, eastern cottonwood, black willow. Those are your three dominant species that you would find. And then eventually, if you leave that levee and now you're down in the floodplain, the levee's part of the floodplain, but you drop down in the elevation, now you're in the floodplain or the bed of the floodplain, you run into things like water hickory and overcup oak. And then if you end up in some swales, so we have ridge and swale topography here. Well, the swales are actually depressions, and those that hold water more often than not, tend to have things like bald cypress and water tupelo and water elm. And anyhow, just kind of showing you then that, this is something else to take into consideration and not something I mentioned in part 1. I'm sorry I ran out of time. I'm sorry I went over by about 5 minutes, but yeah, I hope y'all learned some stuff, and I'll turn it over to Neil. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. That was an outstanding presentation. You packed a lot of good information in just a short time. I think we could have spent a whole day on this, and I don't think we would have lost a soul. We've seen a lot of positive comments, and I think you've really reached your audience in a very effective way. I know you have me. I don't know that we have, how much time we want to spend on this. I know some folks have to leave, but Katie, can we overrun our schedule here just for Chris to answer a couple of questions?
Yes, and we do have a few questions. The first one, do scarlet, northern red, or black oaks also have sourwood companions?
Do they have sourwood components?
Companions.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, there are a lot of species and more than obviously that we could cover. So, oh my goodness. Yeah, it's a long list. It's probably too many to go through. I think the thing to do would be to look at the southern forest cover types in the book, and look at the ones that occur in those xeric uplands. Yeah, sorry, I should have given you a list, but for the sake of time, there's a bunch.
Okay, another question. If you are just observing the bark, are there any good ways to distinguish between chestnut oak bark and sassafras oak bark?
Yeah, sassafras bark, if you chip away at it with your pocket knife or even a branch or something that's laying out in the woods and you break it, it'll be orange. That's not the case with chestnut oak. So yeah, sassafras, to me, one of the good bark characteristics is just break it a little bit or take your pocket knife and scratch it, and you'll see it's bright orange there underneath that outer layer.
Okay, and another one, do you have much natural hybridizing between red oaks and black oaks? If so, how does that affect ID?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about hybridization among oaks like the ones they've asked about. But yeah, I've worked with Ron Lance enough to know, and I would consider him the expert of oak trees, maybe worldwide. He's got to be top 3 or top 5 in the world. And Ron, to me, always he gets to species. So I don't think he blows off the hybridization stuff, but it's not as maybe prevalent as we think. That would be my answer there. One thing to mention about, kind of a friendly neighbor of the chestnut oak, scarlet oak, and it occurs in the mid-story typically, is going to be mountain laurel. So it's one of the heath shrubs. So Kalmia latifolia, mountain laurel is very common and actually can choke out regeneration of oaks, but it is very commonly found with those two.
And one more, how do you ID Mexican sycamore and American sycamore in the wintertime without any leaves?
That's a good question. I'd say it's based on where I'm at. So if I'm not in an arboretum, then American sycamore is the one that occurs here naturally. And I've not really investigated the other species much at all. So I don't have much experience with that one, or enough to even, speak on that particular topic. It does bring something up that I'm very passionate about. And we've lost the American chestnut. We're now losing our ash trees. I think it's very important for this audience to understand where I stand. We need to plant native. It's so important. We're in a water crisis right now worldwide. more so than ever here in the United States. It's just, it's unbelievable. So we need to be planting trees that are locally adapted, and typically those are going to be native species. I think the horticulture industry is finally kind of getting on board a little bit, but in my opinion, not enough.
Okay, and one more, where does cherry bark oak fall into the mix?
Fall into where?
Into the mix.
Wait, say it one more time.
Where does cherry bark oak fall into the mix?
Oh, okay. No, that's a good question. Cherry bark oak looks similar to southern red oak if you were to look at the two, but cherry bark oak is more associated with bottomlands, so our floodplain forests. And cherry bark oak typically occurs on that last ridge before you leave the bottomland or the floodplain. And cherry bark oak tends to be, it may be the most valuable red oak in the state of Tennessee. Extremely valuable, but again, it's going to look like southern red oak, which is one I went over, the bell-shaped leaves or turkey foot leaves, rounded base and stuff. But again, cherry bark oak is going to be in bottomlands on that last ridge before you leave the floodplain.
I want to follow up on a key point you made, which really struck home for me, and why you spent so much time on the forest types and where trees are naturally grown and where they've evolved. And it made me think, here in Middle Tennessee, we see a lot of white pine, pin oak, sycamore, and red maple planted in our cities. A lot of dollars are spent, and there's a lot of failures with these species. And, you know, it's because they did not evolve in an area with our habitat or our alkaline soils and our limestone rock and whatnot. But I think if most of us understood where these trees originally were suited and where they naturally grow, we would do a better job of selecting species, native species, as you told us we need to do more of, in the right place.
Hear, hear.
And the last comment is, I think a lot of folks, you know, my interest always piqued when I hear topics and presentations like yours, but, you know, how do we follow up where we live, where trees might be a little different? And I know in this state, there's a lot of arboreta across Tennessee, over 100. And I'm sure there's others across the country. And to me, that would seem like a nice place for folks that want to follow up on what does well in their area and how to identify trees that they could start to enhance and grow their knowledge of trees and identifying them. But anyway, that was just a thought there. Do you have any other suggestions on how folks can follow up on their own learning where they live?
I think I went over most of the points I wanted to make in part one, and then a little bit of that in this session today too. So I just want to encourage people. I think, you know, it's, if you know, if they're excited about it, then I've found, at least with students that I teach, it's amazing how much they can learn with effort. So the ones that are putting forth the effort, it just blows my mind how quickly they learn and how much they can learn. It's a little bit mind-boggling. I mean, because they think, oh, I can't do this. There's just no way. And then, yeah, if they put forth the effort, I found that, you know, they surprise themselves.
Okay. And Katie, before we wrap this up with some announcements, I'm seeing a lot of comments requesting a part 3 on this tree ID course. So not putting pressure on you, Chris, but the audience are responding. So
Okay.
just brainstorm on that. We're willing to host something if you want to follow up on this topic.
Okay.
Katie, can we slip to some of our closeout slides, some reminders and whatnot, and things that are coming up? Okay. Yeah, just these are the folks that have been involved in this, setting up these webinars. And of course, you know, it's a team effort, but I appreciate all the work that these folks do to help make this possible. And we just want you to know that it's a team effort. What's next? All right, the CEUs, we've talked about that. I've noticed a lot of folks have sent in their names and ISA certification numbers. You still have time to do that if you have not. This did qualify for one CEU. And then the next slide. The reason we want to keep promoting this Southern Chapter meeting is that the ISA Southern Chapter has been real helpful to us in getting the CEUs, and they're great organizations. And a lot of you are members of ISA and the Southern Chapter, and the annual meetings coming up this March 26th through 28th in Chattanooga. We encourage you to register and attend that. And if you want to volunteer, there's opportunities to do that. But we appreciate all that the ISA Southern Chapter does for us here in Tennessee and the several states that it represents. And then is this the last one, Katie? Oh yes. The Tennessee Urban-Forestry Council is a volunteer organization, depends on your support, not just supporting our programs, but also financially. And there's a QR code that we have there. If you'd like to donate to the Tennessee Urban-Forestry Council, we would welcome you in doing that. And Katie, where are we? And then lastly, we have another webinar this week featuring some folks that have been involved in heat island studies in the state of Tennessee in concert with NOAA, the federal agency NOAA. And there's some good information on how trees can be a part of the solution. And if that's something that interests you in the community that you live, I think you'll want to attend this free webinar. And it also qualifies for a certified ISA certified CEU. So we hope to see you this Thursday at 11 a.m. Central Time, noon Eastern Time. And Katie, is that it?
That is it.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. And send us your ideas for future topics. And we hope to see you again. Thanks.